The wind swept across the olive groves of the Malame Valley at 6:43 in the morning when Konstantinos Papadakis heard the sound that would change his life forever. It was not the distant thunder of British bombardments in Suda Bay, nor the familiar drone of Stukas that had been terrorizing the island for weeks. It was something different. A deep, continuous roar like the rumble of 1,000 giant bees approaching from the northern horizon. The 60-year-old farmer dropped his hoe onto the parched soil, wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his calloused hand, and raised his eyes to the sky still pink from the Mediterranean dawn. What he saw froze his blood. Hundreds of dark specks began to blossom like sinister flowers against the cobalt blue. Parachutes, dozens, then hundreds of them, descending in waves over the olive groves, the vineyards, the wheat fields his family had cultivated for generations. Konstantinos was not a soldier. He had never been one. His war had been against the dry earth, the pests, the winters that lasted too long. But in that moment, May 20th, 1941, the war came to him. And he had no intention of running. The shotgun hanging above the fireplace in his stone house had belonged to his father, and before him, to his grandfather. An old double-barrel model, its metal darkened by decades of rust and use. The mechanism jammed sometimes. The stock was cracked, patched with baling wire. But Konstantinos knew every inch of that weapon like he knew the lines of his own palm. He had hunted hares and partridges with it since before he could remember. Now, for the first time in its long existence, it would hunt men. The German paratroopers descending upon Crete that morning were no ordinary soldiers. They were the Fallschirmjäger, Hitler's elite airborne warriors, veterans of the lightning conquests of Norway, Belgium, and the Netherlands. They had been hand-picked from the finest recruits in the Wehrmacht, trained to an almost superhuman standard of physical fitness and combat proficiency. Each one of them had undergone months of grueling preparation at the jump schools of Stendal and Wittstock, learning to exit aircraft at terrifying speeds, to control their descent through hostile skies, to land ready to fight. But there was a flaw in their doctrine, a vulnerability that would prove catastrophic on this particular morning. German paratroopers did not jump with their primary weapons. Unlike their British and American counterparts, who would later develop techniques to carry rifles and submachine guns during descent, the Fallschirmjäger dropped armed only with pistols and gravity knives. Their rifles, machine guns, and heavier weapons were packed into separate canisters that descended on their own parachutes, often landing hundreds of meters from the men who needed them. The theory was sound in controlled conditions. In the chaos of combat, it was a death sentence. Konstantinos did not know any of this as he loaded 2 shells into the breech of his father's shotgun. He did not know that the young man drifting toward his olive grove was an Obergefreiter named Werner Hoffmann, 23 years old, from a small town near Munich. He did not know that Werner had written to his mother just 2 days earlier, promising to bring her a bottle of Cretan wine when the operation was over. He did not know that Werner's pistol held only 8 rounds, and that the canister containing his carabiner 98K had already drifted half a kilometer to the east, where it would land in a field occupied by a very angry New Zealand sergeant with a Bren gun. What Konstantinos knew was this: strangers were falling from the sky onto his land. And on Crete, you did not allow strangers to take what was yours. If you are enjoying this narration, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. Stories like these deserve to be remembered, and your support helps us continue bringing them to life. The history of Cretan resistance stretched back centuries before Werner Hoffmann ever set foot in a Junkers transport. This mountainous island at the crossroads of 3 continents had been invaded countless times by Venetians, by Ottomans, by anyone who saw value in controlling the eastern Mediterranean. And every single time, the Cretans had fought back, with a ferocity that bewildered their conquerors. The island's terrain favored defenders. Jagged mountain ranges split the interior into isolated valleys, each one a potential ambush site, each one home to villages that had maintained their martial traditions through generations of occupation. Cretan men learned to shoot before they learned to read. They carried weapons as casually as they carried walking sticks. Feuds between families could last for decades, settled not in courts, but in blood. The Germans were about to discover what Ottoman janissaries and Venetian soldiers had learned centuries before. Crete did not surrender easily. General Kurt Student, the architect of Operation Mercury, had anticipated resistance from the British and Commonwealth forces garrisoning the island. Intelligence suggested approximately 5,000 defenders, though the actual number was closer to 42,000. What Student had not anticipated, what no one in the German High Command had even considered, was that the civilian population would fight. In the calculus of modern warfare, civilians were obstacles to be managed, populations to be administered. They were not supposed to pick up weapons and start eliminating elite paratroopers. That miscalculation would cost Student dearly. Werner Hoffmann touched down in Konstantinos's Olive Grove at approximately 7:15 in the morning, local time. His landing was textbook, knees bent, rolling to absorb the impact, hands already working to release his parachute harness. He was on his feet within seconds, pistol drawn, scanning the terrain for threats and for the colored parachute that would mark his weapons canister. He saw neither. What he saw instead was an old man in peasant clothes, standing perhaps 40 yards away, holding what appeared to be an ancient hunting shotgun. For a moment, neither of them moved. Werner's training told him to seek cover, to assess the situation, to wait for his squad mates to link up, but his training had not prepared him for this. His training had assumed that civilians would flee, would cower, would behave like the populations of Poland and France and Greece itself had behaved when the Wehrmacht came. Konstantinos Papadakis did not flee. He did not cower. He raised the shotgun to his shoulder, sighted down the rust-pitted barrel, and pulled the trigger. The physics of what happened next were simple, but devastating. A 12-gauge shotgun loaded with No. 4 buckshot releases approximately 27 lead pellets with each trigger pull. At 40 yards, those pellets have spread into a pattern roughly 30 inches in diameter, traveling at approximately 900 feet per second. Against a target in light combat gear, the effect is catastrophic. Werner never even got a shot off. The first barrel caught him in the chest and shoulder, spinning him around, dropping him to his knees. The second barrel, fired perhaps a half-second later, finished what the first had started. 23 years of life, of dreams, of letters to his mother, ended in a Cretan olive grove, ended by a 60-year-old farmer with a rusty shotgun that had been built to hunt birds. Konstantinos stood there for a long moment, watching the body, watching the white silk of the parachute flutter in the morning breeze. He felt nothing. Later, perhaps, the magnitude of what he had done would settle upon him. Later, he would wonder about the young man's family, about the mother who would receive a telegram, about the friends who would never see their comrade again. But not now. Now there was only the practical reality that more shapes were descending from the sky and 2 spent shells in his shotgun. He broke open the breech, ejected the casings, and reloaded. Across Crete, similar scenes were playing out with a frequency that bordered on the surreal. In Castelli, a town on the western tip of the island, German paratroopers from the reconnaissance battalion expected to secure an auxiliary landing area with minimal resistance. Instead, they found themselves facing a combination of Greek soldiers, gendarmerie, and armed civilians who fought with a fury that veteran NCOs would later describe as almost inhuman. The civilians of Castelli were not soldiers. They had no training in small unit tactics, no understanding of suppressive fire or flanking maneuvers. What they had was intimate knowledge of their terrain, generations of marksmanship practice, and an absolute refusal to see their homes occupied by foreign invaders. They fought from rooftops and doorways, from behind stone walls, and from the upper floors of their own houses. They used hunting rifles, shotguns, pistols, and when ammunition ran out, they used knives, axes, scythes, and farm implements. One elderly woman, whose name has been lost to history, reportedly eliminated a paratrooper with a kitchen knife when he landed in her courtyard. Another man, a shepherd in his 70s, used his crook to beat a German soldier unconscious, then finished him with the soldier's own weapon. These were not acts of organized resistance. They were the spontaneous, visceral reactions of a population that simply refused to accept invasion. The Germans had trained for many scenarios. They had not trained for grandmothers with meat cleavers. By noon on the first day, the scope of the disaster was becoming clear to German commanders. Casualties were astronomical, far beyond anything anticipated. An entire company of the 3rd Battalion, 1st Assault Regiment, had lost 112 men out of 126. The 3rd Battalion as a whole had lost 400 of its 600 men by sunset. The paratroopers dropped near Chania were being systematically destroyed by New Zealand defenders and Greek forces. The gliders following the initial drops had been torn apart by mortar fire seconds after landing. And everywhere, mixed in with the reports of Allied military resistance, came bewildering accounts of civilian attacks. Farmers with shotguns, villagers with axes, children throwing rocks with deadly accuracy. The elite of the Luftwaffe's airborne forces were being eliminated not just by professional soldiers, but by the very population they had expected to subdue effortlessly. General Student, monitoring the operation from his headquarters in Athens, found himself in an impossible position. He had committed virtually the entire German parachute force to this single operation, betting everything on a quick seizure of the island's airfields. If those airfields did not fall, if reinforcements could not land, the invasion would collapse. And if the invasion collapsed, the cream of Germany's airborne capability would be destroyed, stranded on an island full of people who seemed to actively enjoy eliminating them. The fighting around Maleme airfield was particularly savage. This was the primary objective, the lodgment that would determine the success or failure of the entire operation. New Zealand troops held the high ground overlooking the runway, dug into positions on Hill 107 that commanded every approach. German gliders attempting to land near the airfield were shot to pieces before their occupants could disembark. Paratroopers who made it to the ground found themselves pinned down, unable to reach their weapons canisters, picked off by marksmen who could shoot the wings off a fly at 200 yards. Konstantinos Papadakis joined the fighting around Maleme on the second day. By then, his shotgun had accounted for 3 more Germans, all of them caught in the confused no-man's land between the drop zones and the defended positions. He had acquired a carabiner 98K from one of his victims, along with a belt of ammunition and a gravity knife that he had no intention of ever using. The rifle was a revelation. Accurate at ranges the shotgun could never hope to match, it transformed him from a defender of his immediate property into something approaching an actual combatant. He was not alone. By the second day, Cretan civilians throughout the western part of the island had organized themselves into impromptu resistance groups. They did not have ranks or unit designations. They did not have supply lines or communications networks. What they had was local knowledge, personal weapons, and an absolute burning hatred for the invaders who had brought war to their homes. These civilian fighters developed tactics through bitter experience. They learned to target paratroopers during descent when the Germans were helpless, hanging beneath their canopies, unable to maneuver or return fire effectively. They learned to watch for the colored parachutes that marked weapons canisters, racing to reach them before their owners could. They learned to use the terrain, the stone walls, the olive groves, the rugged mountains to offset their lack of military training. Most importantly, they learned to fight without mercy. The Germans were not ordinary enemies. They were invaders, violators, men who had come to take what Cretans had defended for centuries. There would be no prisoners taken, no wounded left alive, no quarter given or expected. This was not war as the staff colleges taught it. This was something older, something more primal. This was the rage of a people defending their ancestral land. The German response, when it came, was predictable and savage. Unable to understand why civilians were fighting, unable to process a paradigm where non-combatants became combatants, the Wehrmacht fell back on the only response it knew: reprisal. If civilians resisted, civilians would be punished. The mathematics were simple and brutal. For every German soldier eliminated by a civilian, 10, 20, 50 Cretans would be executed. The village of Condamari was among the first to experience this logic. On June 2, 1941, German paratroopers gathered the male inhabitants of the village, lined them against a wall, and shot them. The massacre was photographed by a German military photographer named Franz Peter Weixler, who was so disturbed by what he witnessed that he later gave his photographs to the Swiss Red Cross. Those images, showing young men and old men standing together in their final moments, would become some of the most powerful visual documents of Nazi atrocities in Greece. But the reprisals did not break Cretan resistance. If anything, they intensified it. Every execution created new fighters. Every burned village produced refugees who had nothing left to lose and everything to avenge. The Germans had stumbled into a cycle of violence they could not escape, a war they could win militarily but never pacify completely. The turning point at Malem came on the night of May 20th, not through German brilliance, but through Allied miscommunication. Lieutenant Colonel Leslie Andrew, commanding the 22nd New Zealand Battalion on Hill 107, made a fateful decision to withdraw his surviving troops rather than risk destruction by a force he believed to be much larger than it actually was. The hill was abandoned. The airfield was left undefended, and by morning German transport planes were landing on the runway, disgorging mountain troops who would finally give the airborne forces the reinforcement they desperately needed. Konstantinos was on the slopes east of the airfield when the first Junkers touched down. He watched through borrowed binoculars as gray-clad soldiers poured from the aircraft, watched as more planes followed, watched as the trickle became a flood. He understood in that moment that the battle was lost. Not the war, perhaps, but this particular fight. There were too many of them now, too many planes, too many soldiers, too much firepower for a collection of farmers and scattered infantry to resist. He retreated into the mountains as Cretans had been doing for centuries when the lowlands became untenable. He was not alone. Thousands of others, civilian and military alike, melted into the rugged interior, where roads were scarce and knowledge of the terrain was worth more than artillery. The British and Commonwealth forces were evacuating, fighting rearguard actions that bought time for ships to reach the southern ports. But the Cretans were not evacuating. This was their home. They had nowhere else to go. The Battle of Crete officially ended on June 1, 1941, with German forces in control of the island, but the resistance continued. It would continue for 4 years, through ambushes and assassinations, through intelligence networks that fed information to Cairo and London, through acts of sabotage that kept German garrison troops on edge every moment of every day. Konstantinos Papadakis survived the initial battle. He survived the occupation that followed. He survived the reprisals that took so many of his neighbors, his friends, his family members. The rusty shotgun that had accounted for his first enemy was lost somewhere in the mountains, abandoned when he acquired better weapons from fallen adversaries. But the memory of that first encounter, of the young German floating down into his olive grove, of the 2 shots that changed him from farmer to fighter, remained with him until the end of his days. The cost of Operation Mercury was staggering by any measure. German casualties exceeded 6,000 men, including nearly 4,000 killed or missing. This represented roughly 1/3 of the entire parachute force committed to the operation. More critically, it represented an irreplaceable loss of experienced airborne troops, men who could not be replaced by simple recruitment and training. Adolf Hitler, reviewing the casualty figures, reached a conclusion that would shape the remainder of the war. The age of large-scale airborne operations, he decided, was over. The paratroopers had lost their most valuable asset: surprise. Any future enemy would know what to expect, would prepare accordingly, would turn every drop zone into a killing field. The Fallschirmjäger would continue to serve, but as elite infantry, not as airborne assault troops. They would fight at Stalingrad, at Monte Cassino, at 100 other battles across Europe and North Africa. But they would never again descend from the sky in the numbers that had darkened the Cretan dawn. The Western Allies drew precisely the opposite conclusion. Where the Germans saw failure, British and American planners saw possibility. The concept of airborne assault was sound, they believed. The execution had been flawed. With better equipment, better tactics, better coordination with ground forces, paratroopers could still achieve decisive results. This analysis would lead directly to the creation of the British 1st Airborne Division, the American 82nd and 101st, the operations at Sicily and Normandy and Arnhem that would define airborne warfare for generations to come. And on Crete, the killing continued. The resistance that Konstantinos and his fellow Cretans built during the occupation became one of the most effective in all of occupied Europe. Operating from mountain strongholds that the Germans could never fully control, they maintained networks of spies and couriers, organized arms drops from British aircraft, and carried out operations that tied down thousands of occupation troops. The most famous of these operations, the kidnapping of General Heinrich Kreipe in 1944, demonstrated that no German, regardless of rank, was safe on the island. British Special Operations executive agents, inserted by submarine and parachute, worked alongside Cretan fighters in a partnership that would become legendary. Men like Patrick Leigh Fermor and William Stanley Moss lived in caves and shepherds' huts, coordinating operations, training guerrillas, turning the amateur resistance of 1941 into a professional fighting force. The Cretans provided the manpower, the local knowledge, the unquenchable will to resist. The British provided weapons, communications, and connection to the broader war effort. The Germans responded with increasing brutality. Villages suspected of harboring resistance fighters were burned. Hostages were taken and executed. Entire regions were subjected to collective punishment designed to terrorize the population into submission. The massacres at Condomari, at Candanos, at Vianos, at dozens of other sites across the island claimed thousands of civilian lives. But each atrocity only deepened Cretan hatred, only strengthened Cretan resolve. By 1944, the German garrison on Crete had been reduced to a defensive crouch. Unable to patrol the countryside safely, unable to gather intelligence, unable to trust any interaction with the local population, the occupiers withdrew to fortified positions around the major towns. They remained there, effectively besieged on an island they nominally controlled until the end of the war. When they finally surrendered in May 1945, they insisted on surrendering to British forces rather than Greek ones, fearing the retribution that 4 years of occupation had earned them. Konstantinos Papadakis was present at that surrender. He was 64 years old by then, weathered by 4 years of mountain warfare, by grief for fallen comrades, by the accumulated weight of everything he had seen and done. He watched the German columns march into captivity, watched the men who had terrorized his island reduced to prisoners, and felt something that might have been satisfaction but was probably just exhaustion. The shotgun was long gone. So was the carabiner. So were most of the men he had fought beside during those first chaotic days of the invasion. But the olive grove was still there, scarred by 4 years of neglect, but still standing, still producing, still connecting him to the generations who had worked that land before him. He went home to tend it, as his father had done, as his grandfather had done. The war was over. The farming continued. The story of Crete in World War II is often told as a military history, a tale of battalions and brigades, of strategic objectives and tactical failures. But at its heart, it is a story about people like Konstantinos Papadakis, ordinary civilians who refused to accept the extraordinary circumstance of invasion. They fought with whatever they had, rusty shotguns, kitchen knives, bare hands. They died in numbers that will never be accurately counted. And they demonstrated something that military planners too often forget, that wars are not fought only by soldiers. The Fallschirmjäger, who descended on Crete that May morning, were among the finest warriors in the world. They were fit, trained, motivated, equipped with the best weapons German industry could provide. They should have swept aside any resistance from a population of farmers and fishermen. Instead, they found themselves in a nightmare, assailed from every direction by enemies who did not wear uniforms, who did not follow rules, who seemed to materialize from the landscape itself. 40 yards. That was the distance between Konstantinos and Werner Hoffmann on that first morning. 40 yards between a farmer and a paratrooper, between a rusty shotgun and an elite warrior. It should not have been a fair fight. By any conventional measure, it was not a fair fight. The German had youth, training, military bearing on his side. The Cretan had only his weapon, his land, and his absolute refusal to surrender either. The shotgun won. It won not because it was a superior weapon, but because it was in the hands of a man who knew how to use it, a man fighting for something more than military objectives, a man who understood that the person falling from the sky was not just an enemy soldier, but a violation of everything he held sacred. That understanding, that fierce territorial imperative, was something no amount of training could overcome. The Battle of Crete changed the course of the war in ways that are still debated by historians. It delayed the German invasion of the Soviet Union by several critical weeks, though how critical those weeks actually were remains controversial. It eliminated Germany's ability to conduct large-scale airborne operations, closing off strategic options that might have altered the conflict's trajectory. It demonstrated the potential of partisan resistance, inspiring similar movements across occupied Europe. But perhaps its most important legacy was the example it set. Crete proved that occupation was not inevitable, that civilians could resist, that even the mightiest military machine could be made to bleed. That example would echo through the decades that followed, inspiring resistance movements from France to Yugoslavia to the jungles of Vietnam. The image of the elderly farmer with his hunting shotgun standing against the elite paratrooper became a symbol of something that no army could ever fully suppress: the human refusal to submit. Konstantinos Papadakis died in 1967 at the age of 86. He never wrote a memoir, never gave interviews, never sought recognition for what he had done during the war. The story of his first encounter with Werner Hoffmann survived only in family oral tradition, passed down through children and grandchildren who may have embellished details over the years. The exact distance, the exact circumstances, the exact sequence of events can no longer be verified with certainty. But the essence of the story remains true. An old man with an old weapon stood his ground against an invader and won. That happened on Crete in May 1941, not once, but hundreds of times, in variations that ranged from shotguns to pitchforks to bare hands. Each encounter was unique. Each encounter was also part of a larger pattern, a collective refusal that transformed a military operation into a bloodbath. The Germans never forgot what happened on Crete. Veterans of the operation spoke of it in hushed tones, describing an enemy unlike any they had faced before. The statistics tell part of the story. The human cost tells the rest. On both sides, men died who should have lived, who would have lived if events had unfolded differently. The mathematics of war are always brutal. On Crete, they were especially so. Today, the olive groves still grow in the valley of Malem. The airfield is now a peaceful civilian facility, its runway bearing no trace of the battles fought for its control. Monuments mark the sites of major engagements commemorating the fallen of all nations who fought there. Tourists visit the German cemetery at Malem, where thousands of young men lie buried far from the homes they left behind. They also visit the memorials to Cretan resistance fighters, to the civilians who took up arms against impossible odds. The shotgun, if it survived, has never been found. It was probably abandoned in the mountains during the long years of resistance, left to rust in some forgotten cave or shepherd's hut. But its story survives, part of the larger narrative of a battle that changed history, a battle where ordinary people did extraordinary things. 40 yards, 2 shots, 1 farmer. That is how resistance begins, not with armies or strategic plans, but with individuals who decide that some things are worth fighting for. Konstantinos Papadakis made that decision on a May morning in 1941. So did thousands of his fellow Cretans. Together they wrote a chapter of World War II that deserves to be remembered not just for its military significance, but for what it reveals about the human capacity for resistance. The paratroopers thought they were invading an island. They discovered they were invading a people. The difference cost them dearly. And in the olive groves of Malem, where the bones of the fallen have long since returned to earth, the wind still carries whispers of what happened there, whispers of shotguns and silk parachutes, of young men who fell from the sky and old men who refused to let them land. Whispers of a battle that was supposed to last days and instead lasted years. Whispers of Crete,